welcome to our federal politics panel. Allan, please take it away. Thanks so much, gentlemen.
Thank you, Taylor, and thank you for having us here. We have three of the best thinkers and talkers on Canadian politics here. All of them also, I should mention, command absolutely obscene fees for proffering their advice. And today they're doing it pro bono as a consequence of the worthiness of You have their bios in depth, so I'm just going to introduce very, very briefly. Scott Reid, former advisor to Paul Martin, many other Liberal candidates. Jamie Watt, former communications director and advisor to Mike Harris and many Conservative politicians. Robin Sears, former chief of staff to Ed Broadbent and Bob Ray, and now an objective chronicler of the human condition, as I am, no longer partisan. I want to start very, very broadly and just get each of your assessments of how the campaign has gone thus far, where we are. I mean, who's up, who's down, who's got momentum, or has nothing changed at all, Scott?
Well, it's an uninteresting answer, but I don't think a lot has changed. I think we saw a little bit of change right out of the box. Liberals took themselves up from sort of whatever, the mid-20s or something, got something going around 30, and they've been stuck there. And depending on which of the insane polls you believe, Stephen Harper's sort of, you know, right on the brink of majority territory, 36, 37, 38, 39, whatever. And I don't think a lot has happened. Two things that I think are interesting about the campaign so far. For the first couple of weeks, the media and dialogue around the campaign was clearly content to discuss it as a two-man race, as a Harper-Ignatieff play. And you saw Jack working hard to get into the play. I don't know if Robin will agree with this, but that would be my sense. Not necessarily in a fair reflection of the numbers, but that narrative wanted to triumph. And I think one of the things that's interesting is we've had a couple of events. There's been some strange numbers from some Quebec pollsters about what's going on in the Outaouais and Montreal with the NDP, whether they're coming on. And we saw Jack give, I think, fairly strong performances in the debates, particularly in the French debate. And there's been a lot of media commentary around that, and perhaps some suggestion in the last two overnights, which you got to be, you can speak to the pollster about the peril of relying on those too much. But suggesting that maybe the NDP are coming up, not at the expense of their parties, but maybe coming up. So we may see one major development, which is the melting of the two-man narrative into a three-way bun toss, and that would be a significant development and a negative one for the Liberals.
Jamie, what do you make of it?
I agree with Scott. I don't think much has changed, and I think there's a reason for that. I think the campaign's been about fiddling around the margins. It's about being what some people call these scandalettes, which actually don't matter and they actually don't go to anything. And what it's done is it's deprived the campaign, the oxygen for the campaign, of talking about issues that actually matter to Canadians. And I think we talk a lot about the disengagement of Canadians. I think one of the reasons we're disengaged isn't because we put crappy ads on TV. It's because we're not talking about things people actually care about. And so that the effect of that has been to basically lock in the players in the positions they were at the starting gate. So while they've changed a little bit, for sure, prime ministers come down a little bit, the guys have come up a little bit. Mr. Ignatieff is never going to get from first place to top as long as we're not talking about issues. So that's why I don't think much has changed.
Robin?
You know, I was thinking this morning in the shower that this is either the 15th or the 16th federal election that I've observed or played a role in. And I was sort of comparing them in my head in terms of where they've developed in this last one. And I think two things have happened I've never seen before. The first is that there really is a subterranean campaign going on as a result of social media and non-party owned activity. Some of it is social media driven, some of it isn't. But I think that phenomenon of organizations like Lead Now and Student Vote and a whole variety of others have created a dialogue about the election that isn't in the mainstream media and isn't owned by the parties. As a former party campaign manager, I would have hated that and fought against it. But to me, that's an interesting phenomenon. The second one is, I have to admit, I think the media have been especially lazy in chasing things other than the latest shiny bauble dropped in front of their nose in this campaign. There's been much less effort than I think we saw a decade or so ago to get off the bus, to look at regional issues, to look at local stories. Today will be driven by Helena Georges's tear-filled press conference because, hey, it's easy, it's out there. So I think those two phenomena are affecting the campaign in ways that are going to be hard to predict the outcome of, but I think they're real.
I'm going to put all of you to work and give the audience here a little bit of insight into kind of our craft. And I'm going to ask you to give some advice in a non-traditional way. Robin, I want you're the advisor to Stephen Harper. He's got 2 weeks and a couple of days. What's the most important thing he has to do between now and then?
He should emulate the most successful Conservative campaigner of our lifetime, Brian Mulroney, and get out and meet Canadians, get heckled, touch flesh, loosen up. He is a far better campaigner than his handlers have allowed him to be, and as long as he stays in the bubble that they have got him in, he is vulnerable to the attack for being in the bubble. He's an experienced politician. Let him go out and meet Canadians.
You don't think he has to explore any additional themes, any additional policy, simply just get out there and campaign?
He has 2 very powerful messages. I ain't the other guy. Knowing the other guy don't have his marks with a huge chunk of his persuadable voters. And by the way, I promise stability and economic prosperity. They promise chaos. Those are powerful, time-tested political messages. But if you wrap them in a bubble, then it comes with all kinds of negatives about control and discipline and being not open to criticism or suggestion. Put them out in the street. Put them out in a crowd.
Jamie, you get to be Michael Ignatieff's advisor.
Yeah, the advice I'd give Mr. Ignatieff is this. I'd say you've got some terrific members of your caucus. You've got some strong members who've been cabinet ministers before. They're excellent in the media. They know how to fight. I'd assign them the file of beating up on the Prime Minister and his record and whatever you want to kick the crap out of the Prime Minister for. I'd give them to those guys. We call that a surrogate tour. I'd have them blanketing the country, delivering that message. And I'd advise Mr. Ignatieff that hope trumps fear every time. And he's got a great platform. But the problem is we don't know about it yet. If you counted the number of times he actually used the name of his platform, the family pack part of his platform, in the debate, apparently he didn't even say it once. So he's got to be talking to Canadians about what he's got on offer, how he's going to make Canada a better place.
Given how leader-centric the media is, how would you get them to cover the surrogates tour?
Well, I think what you have to do is, that's an excellent question. It is entirely media-centric. And I think what you'd have to do is you'd have to be content for the surrogate to get regional coverage while you got national coverage for your leader. And that's why I wouldn't send 1, I wouldn't send 2, I'd send 6 or 7 or 8 former cabinet ministers and caucus members all across the country. You have Ralph Goodale in Saskatchewan, he's going to get covered.
Sure.
He's not going to get covered in Nova Scotia.
Or you put Bob Ray in Thunder Bay, that's the story.
Absolutely.
That's the story. Scott, give
Is it a big story though? I mean, like, is it, you know, is it going to knock Helena and her baby off the news? I'll be. Let me answer. So I'm doing the math. I got to do the NDP. Is that right?
You're
Okay.
Jack Layton's guy.
All right. Well, I'll start with my usual lovely personality by saying that I just incidentally, in passing, disagree with the advice that both my friends gave to their respective phony leaders. If I was advising Layton, I would say
Did you just call Michael Ignatieff a phony leader?
No, phony in the context of your phony advisors.
He said phony leader.
All right.
I'm going to tweet that right now.
Got a negative ad, right?
And he said it in front of teachers. Even better.
Yeah. And then there's your social media, not owned by parties. It will be in a second. If I was going to, my advice to Jack Layton would be don't be baffled by your own bullshit. All right? And I'll tell you what I mean by that.
I've never met a politician who was capable of that.
No, they tend to love it, actually. But what I mean by that in this instance is this. We've had maybe 36 hours of an elite level discussion about whether something's happening around the NDP. Are they motoring a little bit in parts of Quebec? Is something happening with them? Are they coming up in the polls nationally? Some modest indication that might be the case. They know. They've got internal tracking, and their internal tracking is telling them whether it's true, where it's true, and why it's true. And I would be a slave to math. The big challenge for the NDP might be that they come up 19% and it doesn't accumulate into seats. So where is he going to go? Where is his focus going to be? And why is it working for them? And a big problem for them might be they can elevate their vote level quite substantially in the island of Montreal and it won't translate into a seat
it's
because
a very
the battle.
inefficient vote.
It's a very inefficient vote. They're really not. I don't think there are a handful of, as you move out to the east end of Montreal, only a handful of those ridings are going to be three-way fights. So they could spill a lot of popular support that is making us all talk crazy in the media when we see that, Nanos is at 7:30 in the morning, drop my towel and start talking instantly about what I think of it. Well,
It's actually 7 for most of us, Scott.
well, there we go. I'm late for grooming, but I think he's got to be really focused on what it's going to take to actually translate. If there is anything moving, what's it going to take to translate it into seats? And my guess is focus on Lower Mainland and BC, and I'd give it a week to see if he could do something real in Quebec. And I don't think it's a mistake that he was out yesterday talking, and this morning, talking in Quebec about welcoming Quebec into the constitutional family. He's trying to take votes, not from the Liberals and the Conservatives, if you listen to his narrative. He's trying to take votes from the Bloc, and that's really, really interesting. So I'd say stick to the math, watch what you're doing, and make sure you're trying to be efficient.
I want to get into that a little bit more because, there is some indication that if anyone has momentum, and at this particular point in time, it is Jack Layton and the New Democrats. They just put out a new ad last night that goes after Michael Ignatieff. What's going on there, Robin?
Well, the traditional nightmare for an NDP campaign director is the one Scott framed at the very beginning. It's being shoved by lazy media out of a two-horse race. And fighting your way back into that and into contention is a big challenge. But the parallel challenge is there are a huge number of Canadians who are soft Liberal NDP voters, and they flip back and forth with the tide, leaders, circumstances. And one of the challenges internally for the NDP is if you attack the Liberal brand, or if you attack the Liberal leader, are you more likely to make a soft Liberal voter less comfortable about defecting to the NDP? So there's always a huge debate internally. Do you simply attack the Conservatives and say, we're better Conservative attackers than they are, which is
Right.
the way you saw Jack start off, or do you then go to the next level and say, not only that, they're not any different than the Tories, and you got to vote for us if you want real change. And that's the tension they're playing with.
Given, Jamie, that a disproportionate number of Liberal voters have a second choice as the New Democrats, which makes sense why they're doing this, is there any chance that the New Democrats could catch the Liberals in this campaign? And if they did, does that change everything?
Well, wow, if they did, it would change everything. I don't think so. Doesn't feel like that's what's taking place. And I think one of the reasons that Jack is actually focusing in Quebec as well is that the interesting thing about Quebec for all of us who talk about this on television or write about it in the newspaper or whatever is everyone's, of course, preoccupied and fascinated with Quebec. So he gets an additional buzz, even though Scott's right to say go focus on British Columbia. He doesn't actually create the same media buzz that making some progress in Quebec. There's all this mythology about Quebec, right? We don't really understand it. Even those of us who grew up there are not quite sure. And this idea that there's these massive shifts at the last minute and so on. So, it might happen, but wouldn't that be a story if it did?
And it's your Everest, right, Robin?
Yeah.
For the party.
For sure.
In 1988, I remember a post-campaign kangaroo court I was subjected to, along with the rest of the campaign leadership.
This was when you were measuring the drapes at Stornoway, right? In 88?
Well, when some of the others were. And I said plaintively, we did get more seats.
Robin was happy with the color they were.
We did get more seats than we've ever elected in our lives. We did get a higher popular vote than we've ever elected in our lives. And a certain leading Canadian trade unionist pointed his finger at me and said, why did you waste $2 million in Quebec, you idiot? If you'd spent that money in Ontario, we could have been at Stornoway. And I said, because I knew I was not going to be returning to this role, if I had 4, I would have spent 4, you jerk. Because the only way for a party to move from being regional third-party player is to have a base in Quebec. And that is as true today as it was 25 years ago.
Yep.
So from Jack's point of view, if this is his last election or if this is his second last election, it's close to the end of his career. What does he want as a legacy? Another 2 seats in BC or a breakthrough in Quebec?
The Americans often in their campaigns talk about the October surprise, something that happens at the last part of the campaign. I remember again 88 where the Conservatives did not want free trade to become the issue, but you couldn't stop it. Is there the possibility that again in these last 2 weeks that an issue could dominate, a theme, something could dominate that completely sees all of the campaigns? And if so, what might that be, Scott?
I think it would have to be a truly external event, and I don't mean
Something not generated by the campaigns themselves.
Well, I think it would have to be similar to 2006, right, where you had the RCMP sort of intervene in the campaign,
Right.
and it altered everything. And literally, we went from an 18-point lead,
We being the Liberals in this.
We being the Liberals in 2006, the day before that letter was released. We had, according to our tracking, an 18-point lead in Ontario. 4 days later, we were at a 5-point deficit. Okay, like that is literally a nuclear weapon has just erupted on your hands. And I think we would need, in this campaign, you would need one of these reports, one of these things. You would need them to actually come out, like the AG's report. You would need the Afghan documents to come out. You would need another development of another report or something like that that does two things. One, it actually comes out and is lethal on Harper, and two, it actually provides a steamroll vehicle to incorporate all that stuff and all those doubts and concerns and anxieties that people have about his character. If it's just chicken shit fighting about whether or not something's going to get released and all that stuff, he's sort of built his 36% base that will just la 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 la. So in order to get out of that, it's going to have to be a dramatic thing beyond that.
Jamie, you want to add?
Yeah, I think Scott's analysis on this is exactly right. The Prime Minister's support is like a stock that's discounted for a bad earnings report to come. People have made up their mind, right? And they may not like this guy. They may not want to invite him over, to go campaign with or whatever. But there's a bunch of people who've decided. A bunch of people have decided that they've got a bigger priority, and those people are the people who believe that the economy is the number one priority, and that safe borders are number two priority, whatever. So those people have already said, we don't like this business, this funny business, all this stuff and secrecy, but we've already made up our mind that we're going to go. And that's what's creating the Teflon for him now, because we're seeing all of these things happen, and you watch 3 days later, as Allan will tell you in the nightly tracking, you should be seeing something. Now you're seeing a little bit of chipping away in his support, which is what those attacks are doing. But I don't think they're enough. So I agree with Scott. It's going to have to be something so bad that people will say, enough. All right, I've given this guy, the benefit of the doubt, and now this is too much. But that would have to be something awfully big.
Robin?
Never say never. As
Yeah.
Harold Macmillan famously said, the thing that always trips you up are events. Yeah. I would guess that if it were to happen, it would be in the field of the Tories' rather imprudent outreach to some unsavory folks among new Canadian communities. And if a media organization or one of the other parties were able to find a real smoking gun among some of those people, and there is a hunt going on right now for that, it could have a devastating effect, because I think that would then push the campaign very much to the Liberals' advantage. All of these stories about the 905 seats that have large South Asian and other new Canadian populations voting Tory would flip, and the Liberals would be very strong in Southern Ontario and parts of Quebec and BC again. If there were to be something to happen, that's the only thing I can think it might be.
But it can't be a cap gun, though, right? Because
No.
because we saw this.
It has to be a smoking gun with a body.
Yeah, just because some idiot volunteer said some stupid thing, and of course it took everybody off on a goose chase for a while, but didn't do anything to numbers.
Both the Liberals and the New Democrats are trying to bring health care centrally into this debate, on the assumption that the Conservatives are far weaker on all social policy. Are they going to be successful?
Probably not, but you never know. And the reason I say you never know is if the topic were about healthcare. Let me start again. Let me say it this way. I was really disappointed with the Liberal campaign yesterday, and I'll tell you why. They released a new healthcare ad, and it's very negative and very tough on Harper. You know it's not going to penetrate with media because it's an exaggeration. You know that Harper insulated himself on the 6% escalator, which was really an actual debating point where if he had shimmied on that and said, well, I want to preserve the ability to negotiate, that could be characterized as a cut, and you could have been into the mix, and you could have had a real sort of cleavage there. But he just buzzed that down. So what did they do yesterday? They released an ad. So you have to hope that it just hits with people and it gets them right in the kisser, and they say, you know what, on balance, I don't trust them on health. Since the media aren't going to carry it, than you had to have been talking about in the debate the night before. And for Pete's sake, you've got to be talking about it in terms of the event that you're at. So you can't release that ad, signal to the world, I'm spending money on this, thinking that this may be, right, my big hope. But now I'm going to go do an event that's all about something else, and I'll never give myself an opportunity to actually speak into the microphone about healthcare. And I've established no credibility on the issue over the last couple of nights where I had a chance to put my mitts on them. So I found it was very puzzling. Go back to your question. Do I think it's going to matter? Only if they execute a hell of a lot better, and probably it's only going to matter if the Conservatives kick the issue. If they say something imprudent, they do something stupid, and they walk into the deep end of the pool by accident. That's what he did do in 2004
This time
on healthcare.
he seems to have bulletproofed himself by saying, I will also pledge a 6% increase going forward.
But what's extraordinary about that, Alan, to me, just to go back to my attack on the media for a second here, is we have gone from a situation 3 weeks ago where only the NDP could have predictably have been expected to make a commitment to 6% as a commitment indefinitely into the future of federal expenditure on health care, a la the Martin Accord in 2004, to one where all three parties are committed to it. And let me just describe the enormous consequence of this. It's $30 billion a year, forever, escalating with a whole series of formula relating to provincial health care expenditure. I mean, even in a Canadian budgetary context, that's not small change.
There will have to be huge cuts elsewhere.
Why is somebody not saying, where are you going to get that money? What's it going to come from? Where are the tax implications?
On that, Jamie, I mean, you've both been watching for years and years and years, and also being part of the media. Why is there kind of a complete disinterest in the substantive side of public policy from the journalists?
Well, I think there's the journalists are still reeling from the effects of the recession. Newsrooms have been gutted. The demands on them have escalated. So their world has really turned upside down. I just don't think they simply have the resources that they used to have to cover these things in the way that they might once have.
Is there an assumption, though, perhaps unstated, that there's no appetite for that kind of substantive news coverage, that the electorate essentially is uninterested?
Well, the electorate seems to be uninterested, right? And they seem to be voting with their eyeballs and with their feet. And I think that's something that we need to start looking at. I'm actually beginning to think that when you match low engagement, low voter engagement with a very short 30-plus day writ period.
With trivial coverage.
With trivial coverage, it may no longer be possible to do the two jobs you have to do within that time. So traditionally, campaign strategists have two jobs to do in that time. One is kick the hell out of the other side, and two is to promote your own agenda, your own platform, your own manifesto. It may be that when you've got such low engagement, trivial coverage, and that kind of time, you may not have time to do both anymore within the election. It may be that the Conservatives stumbled, because it was more good luck than good management, but they may have stumbled onto a new paradigm where you actually have to do one of those two jobs outside your writ period.
Pre-writ, yeah, because no one ever did advertising pre-writ.
Not like this anymore. But there may have been a paradigm, we don't know that yet, but it's just something to think about. There may now have been a paradigm shift.
But yeah, you're being too easy on the media, Jamie. Come on. In the days of Clark Davey, the editor of the Globe and Mail, the original Hondrick in charge of the Star, many of the people at the CBC, the idea that you would simply do trivia because you thought that's what people would want to see would never have made it out of an editorial.
There was a higher responsibility and a higher column.
You had a series of people on your staff who knew healthcare policy, and they had to write healthcare stories, and if they got scooped by somebody else, it didn't matter whether people were reading it or giving you pats on the back. You were judging yourself against your competition and your sense of editorial responsibility.
Yeah, but who the hell, I mean, with the greatest of respect, the media organizations are in no position to make that judgment right now. I mean, they are all ailing, right? They are not in good financial health. They have to go where the eyeballs are, and the fact is, it's very disturbing because it becomes a race to the bottom. So what happens is, they're right. People aren't consuming. You put a large piece on healthcare in, a 6,000-word piece that flips into the middle of the paper. It's not going to get digested. It's not going to animate the campaign. It's not going to get retweeted and linked to. So it's not going to achieve those core objectives for you. And then people don't do it. So when newspapers and organizations don't do it, then all the people are left with it. So you get a smaller and smaller number of a pool of people dictating what the coverage is going to be, and there's no room for it. And it is literally a race to the bottom.
I want to get into this just a little bit more, and a little bit more speculatively, and perhaps relevantly, given the audience here. I mean, and without sounding like a nostalgic old fart, I mean, there's no question there was a time when much more attention was paid to policy and substance by journalists. I mean, we know of the notorious low engagement of young people. I remember talking to Chris Dorn when he was running the
Carleton Journalism School. He said that most of the kids who were in there wanted to go into corporate PR. I mean, do we have a cascading kind of effect of young people being disinterested in politics, and as a consequence not entering journalism to do substantive work, and as a consequence deteriorating the entire level of discourse in the country?
I don't want to sound like Pollyanna, Alan, but surely if you treat people stupidly and feed them crap, they're not going to rise to a higher level as a result of that treatment. If you take the opposite perspective and say, as a teacher, you say, we're going to set the bar higher, and we hope by virtue of making it entertaining, informative, and compelling, people will come and read it. Maybe some will.
It's election night. Scott, you're watching TV. If something...
But not the election.
Sorry.
So I'm just like all those assholes you were just talking about. I was watching 2.5 Men. Could be a metaphor for the campaign.
If something really good is going to happen for the Liberals, where would you see it happening?
Geographically, or what issue set, or what's happening?
Geographically. What kind of result would come in? You'd say, something's happening here. What would you be looking for?
I would be definitely looking for a holding gain in 905. And that means that the path to substantial gain for Harper, whether it's a strengthened minority...
So winning some of the seats they lost in 2008.
Winning some of the seats you won in 2008, holding some of them that you would think by all rights you're probably going to drop right now. That would be the number one place. I mean, if you want to know what would overjoy me as a Liberal, is if we were competitive as we were in 2004 and 2006 in the Lower Mainland, where there were genuine three-way races in a lot of those seats, and I don't think they're going to be this time.
Jamie, what would you be watching for on election night?
For the Conservatives?
For the Conservatives.
For the Conservatives, I'd be watching for a hold in Quebec and significant gains in the 905, and if they win any seats in the 416, look out.
A lot of people have been talking that the Conservative campaign is really a ground warfare, that the air campaign in terms of advertising, even the Leaders Tour, hasn't really meant that much. What they're really focusing on is very, very tactical things. They need 3 seats in Newfoundland. They go in there and they do the Lower Churchill deal. Is that your take?
Yes, absolutely. I think one of the things that, like him or not, one of the things that Stephen Harper is extremely good at is animating his base and staying close to his base. I think you'll find that most observers would agree that he has a base that will outperform on election day the others. You know, when you get a bit tired and can't quite make it to the poll, his voters are more likely to make it there. And they've taken that idea and they've actually expanded it and blown it out against those priority ridings to make those. They're very meticulous in making sure that there's not a lack of efficiency in their vote.
Robin, what would you be watching for the NDP? If something good was going to happen, where would you see it first?
I think that it's going to be a combination of seats and popular vote. And New Democrats, my father always used to tease me, are famous for describing victories in terms of popular votes when they lose seats. But I think this time it really will make a difference if, for example, Jack is able to say, we got 20% in Quebec. Even if that only translates into 1 more seat, it gives him a legitimacy.
He's come from 2% in 2004, right?
From literally the basement. Yeah. And that will then set up the dialogue that I think will frame the future if the Conservatives don't make a majority. Because Mr. Harper's endless fascination with the prospect of coalition is not a fantasy. It is a very serious challenge for all the party leaders. If the Tories come back with 140 seats or less, same old minority, I think, is unlikely.
I want to come back to that also. I mean, Robin introduced the notion of social media, and a lot of people said this was going to be the first real social media campaign. I mean, Scott, have you seen anything that's going on in this campaign that's truly unique, truly different, truly kind of cutting edge compared to what we've seen in the past?
Two things that caught my eye. I'm a very recent subscriber to Twitter, so I just started Twitter, and I find it
tweeting, Scott.
I'm tweeting. I'm tweeting all the time. I'm tweeting politely. I'm tweeting impolitely. I'm trying to decide when you're permitted to use swear words and in what context you're not, and that's very difficult to navigate.
And how not to be a twit.
And how not to be a twit. I'm not certain I've mastered that particular test yet, but here's the two things that I've noticed, and the first has been commented upon a lot, and actually it was Chantel who I think made the comment first that I noticed it on the ad issue panel with you guys. It may have been before you were back, actually, at the very outset of the campaign. I'm quite startled by what an internal, instant, constant dialogue there is with media, where a whole pile of things. You want to talk about, in the old days, how people would, how newspaper people would be affronted by what they saw today. I'll tell you what they would really be affronted by. Absolute, bare, uncontested bias, all right? And it's not necessarily a bad
part
thing.
of the reporters.
Right, because people express their opinions. They're moving, they're tweeting in instant time, and you get a pretty strong feel for if someone dislikes someone else, or they kind of call BS constantly on something. So I'm finding that dialogue in the way they whip one another together and whip one another up, and there is a very obvious cyber groupthink that occurs. It used to be there was a groupthink on a bus or on a plane for one campaign.
Right.
Now you're seeing a groupthink
It's a very
on the
interesting
ground, right, at the desks back at the media organizations, and across the campaigns. They're all instantly in dialogue and constantly in dialogue with one another, and I think it's very interesting. I'm not sure if it's a good thing or a bad thing. It's very interesting. The second thing is, a little bit contrary to what we were talking about earlier, I see some pretty rich data and rich policy information and stuff. There's this thing, Pundit's Guide, and man, oh man, it's fantastic. You want to know, like, how does this?
It's a website?
Yeah,
Pundit's Guide.
and they tweet all the time about stuff, so you'll be driven there. They further Facebooking and all that stuff. So you'll see a dialogue will occur among the media, just as I was discussing, and it may begin as something quite superficial, and all of a sudden that woman that runs Pundit's Guide will interrupt the conversation and go, well,
Reality
if you want to
check.
take a look at historical trends going back to 1972, I've got the data and here's the link, and you don't know what you're talking about. And it's really like, so I find that interesting. If you want information, there's no excuse for saying you can't find it.
Jamie, you see anything out there that caught your eye?
I think the only thing that caught my eye is that this is the first election where social media has actually been integrated into mainstream campaign planning. It used to be, of course, nothing, and then we give some kids a little bit of money to go and play somewhere and not bother us. This now is the first time that you see it as a actually mainstream communications, a mainstream communications tool, a way to keep people up to date and to disseminate information, particularly to your own side. I'm not entirely sure how persuasive it is. A lot of resources going in, we'll see how much difference it made. But one thing that it is doing, Scott and I have chatted about this a number of times, is it is driving the mainstream media to be much faster, much more aggressive, much less concerned about getting every I dotted and T crossed, because they're feeling pressured to not get beat by the social media world, and they're putting stuff on there on the front page of the newspaper faster with a little bit less reflection.
Yeah, the news cycle was crazy. I mean, back in the day when Rob and I were running campaigns, you'd organize one event at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and that was, you were finished. For,
Well, and to pick up the point Scott was making, I was just thinking, this idea of cross-pollination between the planes and the buses never happened in the old days. Because once the guys were in the tube in the air for 3 hours, they were locked, and you could work on them for 3 hours, get them good and drunk, feed them the message, and by the time they landed, they'd write your story. But it's a little harder to do that these days, I assume. At the risk of being a little self-promotional, Jamie and I have a firm called Navigator, which has done a lot of work in social media. And one of the things that the young people in our shop have observed is the volume has exploded. So you can make fun of the triviality of it. You can make fun of how much groupthink there is. But it's just on an escalator like that. And I think as teachers, one of the things that you folks will discover in the next campaign, probably more than this one, is that when your students start to use social media to contact campaigns, as they are increasingly doing, it's going to impose a hell of a new burden on everybody on the campaign side to have a class of 30 people in each school, in each city across the country saying, what's your position on the healthcare 6-point commitment?
Well, I mean,
we have no capacity to respond to that right now.
I wanted to ask a variant on that, because I mean, the people who are so-called expert in the social media field, the criticism they have of the political class is that they're using the social media just like traditional media, which is basically a
blast
broadcast medium for, I have something to say, here, I'm using Twitter rather than television to say it now. Third-party organizations, I mean, have we seen any significant influence yet in this campaign in terms of, or I saw a site that came up yesterday, Shit Harper Did, which is quite remarkable, over 1 million hits in 24 hours. Again, obviously organized by someone who is, and they're saying vote anyone but. But do you see any influence by third parties yet?
I think that might be the only example that I can think of. National Citizens Coalition has made an effort to sort of be fairly aggressive online. I'm not convinced that it's making a big dent. So third parties proper, I'm not watching it. I'm really captivated by the internal dialogue that's occurring in public, nevertheless, among media themselves covering the campaign. There's one other thing that I would say, and I think if that criticism is correct, that the political class simply use it as a broadcast tool, it is becoming less correct every single one of these 36 days of the campaign. Because one of the things I find is interesting, and I'm kind of glad I'm not working in a campaign this time, because you are seeing individuals, not third parties, you're seeing individuals actually penetrate dialogue, and you're seeing them actually get, you'll see people going back and forth with Giorno, who's running the Conservative campaign, or Dimitri Soudis, who's the press secretary to the Prime Minister. Dimitri tends to send out these really banal, hard spin sort of tweets, and then people will start making fun of him, right? Festchuk had him going the other day. My partner Scott Festchuk just was tearing the living hell out of him, right?
And he was foolish in
Making fun of
responding.
him. and you know, and Dimitri sort of got into it. And you know, it's interesting. This Jason Leiter guy who's running the Conservative War Room has started dialoguing back and forth with me, and then dialoguing back and forth with these people who are following me, who I don't know, much less he doesn't know. And I just think to myself, that's very, I don't know what to make of it, but it's really interesting.
That's also a prescription for
It's a
big
prescription for
disasters.
because someone's going to say F off, right? And boom, you've got a campaign event.
It's also, I mean, when do these people do work?
Exactly.
I don't know how to
36 days. I mean, you know, it used to be, right, when a candidate of an opposing party knocked on your door, you would invite them in and offer them cookies and coffee and a drink and a bottle of wine just so they couldn't knock on anyone else's door. Well,
Exactly.
I know how to derail the Conservative campaign. Start tweeting with the leadership of the campaign, and no wonder there's no new ads on the air. No, I haven't seen any third-party groups yet, but that's just a matter of time. But to your point about the political class not knowing how to use social media well, I think there's one central reason for that, and that's something that they've really got to get their heads around changing, but it's going to be very difficult. Everyone who's been brought up in this business has always been beaten into them the importance of message control, message discipline, whatever, only once, blah, 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 blah. Like it's everything in our DNA. And of course, in the social media world, that all has to go completely out the window. And having the courage, the organizational and institutional courage to let that go in a world of gotcha journalism, because it's very easy to say, oh, let that go and let the social media world take over and do whatever they want. Well, you saw, in Etobicoke yesterday, when a volunteer sends a stupid email, how do you reconcile the fact that the media will put that kind of a mistake as a lead item with a social media world which has as its fundamental operating system, no control?
After Robin answers, I want to tell a quick story about on that very thing.
I'm going to throw it open to the audience in about 5 minutes, so feel free to start lining up, and then we'll get some questions from the floor. Sorry.
Well, just
No, I just wanted to make one brief observation. I agree with both Jamie and Scott about this, but I think there are two phenomena one can see the beginnings of developing. The first is that it will be very difficult for campaigns if some third-party organization has the smarts to send messages out in a broad enough manner to harass campaigns regularly with demands for information on a subject they care about. Let's say marijuana legalization. One could see absolutely crashing the communications capability of a campaign.
Well, every electronic town hall that's happened in the United States has been dominated,
by those guys. So that's something we've never had to cope with before. Crashing your phone system, that sort of thing has happened historically. But I think the campaigns are going to have to prepare themselves for very concerted, what the geeks would call denial of service attacks in the future from enthusiasts. And the other thing I think one can also see happening is that in the Obama campaign, one of their brilliant achievements, to speak to Jamie's point about control and message discipline, was to say, we don't have the ability to impose it, and the benefit for us of giving it up and simply empowering somebody with some capability locally to organize for us is greater than the risk of chaos or mistakes that they'll make about us. So let 1,000 flowers bloom, as Mr. Ignatieff unfortunately said.
So apparently did Mao.
The implication of that for people of the generations represented here is the central campaign gives up authority to these idiots at the local level? I mean, it's not ever something we would contemplate doing in the past, but I think it's almost inevitable.
Yeah.
The organization is Student Vote. Do campaigns care about the first-time voters, student voters, Scott?
Yeah, they do, but they're unpersuaded because there's little evidence that they're going to vote in large numbers. I can tell you, the Liberal Party, you take a look at EcoSpol. I was having this discussion the other day with our friend David Hurley, and we were talking about it, and he's very distressed by the numbers for the party. And we're talking about that, and he's like, well, there's a further reason I'm distressed about it. He said, let's take a look at Ecosys numbers, right? What if we're sitting there at, 31%? He said, then I take a look at the segments of that, right? Our vote is overwhelmingly young, and those people are not going to come out to vote. If tradition is any indication, so you're going to have a low voter turnout, you're going to have an even lower voter turnout among those who say they're most likely to vote Liberal. So yeah, they care. If they could find a way to animate the vote, even the vote that claims to be there for the party, they'd be delighted. And there's a lot of discussion now when you go back and actually do the analysis on Obama as to whether or not, there was a large assumption that the youth came out, but did it really? And the schools, it looks like probably it was a little more marginal than people first
There certainly was a significant increase in registrations for Democrats. But Jamie, on the other side of that, the conservative vote skews old. We all know that. Is it actually in their best interest to keep students apathetic and not at the polls?
No, I don't think so. I think people that go into public life go into it for overwhelmingly, more than overwhelming, almost exclusively for the right reasons, to make this a better place. We may have a legitimate disagreement on what a better place is, but that's a fair thing for us to have in democracy. But they go to work to make it a better place. Of course they care, like you do, about the next generation. They see the importance of it. Here's where the conflict comes in. People who run campaigns have 30 plus days, and they've got one job to do, which is to get one more vote than their opponent gets. That's their job, right? At the end of the day, everything else is nice to have. But unless they get more votes than the other woman gets, they're not going to win. And so putting a lot of effort against young voters who don't show up doesn't make sense. One of the reasons you see more effort against some of the ethnic communities is their voting behavior has changed. Some of those communities didn't historically vote. And then within themselves,
or if they did, they voted Liberal.
Both. They voted Liberal, and some of them just didn't vote. So they saw that having that exercise their franchise could be a lever they could use in getting power. And we've got to get students, young people, to understand that if they want power, it's circular. If they want people to pay attention to them, they got to show up in numbers to vote, because then the next time people will pay attention to them.
Yeah, but here's the conundrum, folks. This is a complete failure of the political class in most of the Western democracies, including Canada, because you only have to trawl at the very surface of social media to see a huge level of social and potentially political engagement among the people on those websites. They're not politically disengaged, they're partisanly disengaged. And they're partisanly disengaged because the political parties have completely failed to find ways of speaking that touches them where they live. And I think it's a very serious problem for democracy, not to be too alarmist about it.
I've heard you call for the end of the party system.
I have indeed, and I've also called for compulsory voting. I mean, I think when you get to a situation where less than half the people exercise their franchise and they're disproportionately over 50 years of age, you've got a problem calling yourself a democracy.
On that happy note, let's do some guessing. Election outcome. What are the results, Scott?
Well, certainly absent any deviation from what we're looking at, you're going to see another Conservative minority, maybe a modest improvement in Liberal fortunes, maybe not. Or you may see a hairline Conservative majority. But that's
close.
I think they're right on the brink. I think that people, remember in 1997, and I think this campaign feels a lot like 1997 to me, right? It's unelectric. Not a lot is going on. The opposition leaders are we'll have to see with Jack, but they're not lighting it up. And there's not an overwhelming sense of change, mood for change. There's just a kind of a malaise a little bit, you know, a kind of a disengagement. I think, you know, depending on splits, you know, Chrétien won a majority. So don't be surprised that if Harper can't, with his ground game, translate a 38% into a majority.
Jamie, best guess?
I think unless you see a real drop in Conservative fortunes over the next 3 or 4 days, he'll just make it.
Into a majority territory. Robin?
I think I'm closer to Scott. I think that the Tory campaign has sagged in the last couple of days, and the Liberals and the NDP, I think, have a little bit of momentum in a number of places. If the campaign were today, I think I'd predict a slightly smaller Tory minority. They may be able to grind it a little closer to a majority. I think that's as far as I'd go.
Question from the floor?
Thank you very much. Perhaps out of ignorance, which is where most fear is seated, I have a question about projecting Jamie's prediction into the future, the change in political funding. What, in your views, will happen or will not happen to the message, democracy, the system, with proposed changes to, as suggested by the Harper government, otherwise known as the Canadian government?
Jamie, you want to start with that? How does banning or eradicating public funding to the parties, how does that change the game?
Well, it depends how it's eradicated. If it is eradicated with no notice, by that I mean it just is cut off within that fiscal year, it will definitely compromise the other party's ability to raise money. If it is phased in over a reasonable period of time, I'm not actually worried about it, and I'll tell you why. The reason the Conservatives have this great fundraising ability now is not because of any good luck. It's because when Scott's boss, Prime Minister Martin, was in charge, we couldn't raise a dime from any big donor. So there was no money. So the Conservatives had to go out and
explain that. That's because all corporate Canada was.
Yeah, I'm sorry,
money
all
to
corporate
Liberals.
Canada, whatever. And then that's, I'm not complaining about that. That was fair game. They were making their choices. So the Conservatives had to learn how to raise money differently. They now raise money, $50, $60 at a time from Canadians. They raise enough money to fund their operations. My view is that the other parties have just not done that work because they've got the money from the taxpayer. I think if it's phased in over time, they'll build that capability and they'll do just as well as the Conservatives are doing now.
Question here?
Sorry, can I just add a comment on that?
Sure, absolutely.
We had the best election financing system in the world from 1974 till Mr. Martin started tinkering with it. And they wrecked it in a way that, whoops-a-daisy, the Conservatives continued to play games with. I think it is a good idea to cut the central party funding and allow corporations and trade unions and individuals to give more money
Back
to
in
politics.
and make that part of their
because if you
citizenship.
if you don't do that, you end up with the Watergate safe in the president's office full of dollar bills.
Well, let me jump in then. I want to say a couple things too, because if that happens, then what balance is struck is the name of the game. But that's not what Harper has been proposing. What Harper has been proposing is that he would simply eliminate party financing, there'd be no public subsidy of political parties, and there would be no increase in the ability for individuals and corporations or trade unions to donate, effectively locking in what we know is, at least in a transitional standpoint, right, whether an advantage for the Conservatives. Here's my view. You said, Mr. Martin, you're wrong. It was actually Mr. Chrétien.
Apologies, you're right.
But I think that the point, and it doesn't matter that it's a Liberal, I think that it's a really important point. You know how we used to do this? We used to do this for years in the same way that we would change election law. We would do it, we would say, you know what, let's not touch the stove by making it a partisan aspect. So no government would do stuff. You would set up, as Mulrooney did, you would set up the Lord T Commission, have all party experts, people that aren't involved in the partisan activity of the individual, that moment, but folks that know the political system and can appreciate the implications, have them come forward with consensus proposals, and some get taken and some don't. But when Chrétien said, I'm on fire over sponsorship, I need to do something that looks publicly interested on political financing, and I'm going to change it through legislation rather than through that other mechanism, we ended up in a world where there was no reason for Harper to claim that he didn't have exactly the same right, and now that's where we're in this pickle.
I feel a lot of the things that you're talking about are like things that generate an emotional response from people that moves the vote and moves numbers and gets results. But is there anything that you could do, because you're in the public eye so much, while you're on there for about 5 or 10 minutes, whatever it is, in your little spot, that could encourage more issue-centered, a more issue-centered electorate, because right now we're so with the scandals and the big events and scaring, and is there something else that should be happening, even though you did make those comments about the money and the time constraints of the media and stuff like that? What else could you do
good
to help this? Because that's what student vote's about, right?
Go through. I mean,
Right.
Scott, do pundits, do we have A, the responsibility, and B, the influence to actually bring a more kind of reasoned debate to public life?
Well, I think, often, let's just get real about why we're on television. We're on television because we're invited by networks to talk because they think two things. One, we have a level of experience that might be insightful and interesting, and two, we try to be entertaining. And those two things are important to both deposit.
Well, and we love the sound of our own voices.
Well, we do, right? We all think we're fabulously entertaining and spectacular.
So do our mothers.
A few others.
But what would happen is if we said, we're going to have a dialogue, Jamie and I, when we leave here, we're going to CBC to record something. And if we said, sorry, we're not going to discuss it from that perspective, we're going to talk about it strictly from an issue perspective, you know what?
That'd be our last
It would take about 5 of those outings before it would be like,
You were kicked
the
off.
phone isn't ringing. So it does feed into the media dynamic. Now, I think where we can be helpful within our ambit is sometimes we'll talk about what's going on behind the scenes and how those issues are sort of evaluated and managed by parties, and that can take you a little bit more into that zone. I'm not saying that we don't have an obligation. I'm not saying we're not part of the problem. We're talking ads on TV and we're blathering on about the day-by-day scorecarding. But
And we do spend a lot of time on the gotcha stuff and a lot of time on the horse race stuff.
A lot.
Jamie, point?
I think the way to solve this problem, because I take your point, and we should think about it and reflect on if we can do better, but I actually really think the way to solve this problem is for what we do and what you people do to find some common space. Because the way to solve this problem is not in the writ period. The way to solve this is with people the rest of the time, so that they're ready for the writ period. The way to get this change in election time is to prepare people and help them understand these issues and create that awareness in the 2, 3, 4 years between that. And I think there's a role for educators and those of us who go on television to find some common space there.
Because parties respond to incentives. The incentive is the vote.
Last word to Robin Sears.
The most effective panel, the most watched panel on television is, of course, the one that Allan is part of. And I think that environment is better than some of the other ones that we all participate in allowing a discussion of stuff. And maybe one of the ways to pick up Jamie's point, which I think is a very sound one, is to make reference on air to something people can do off air. Like, I wouldn't suggest you recommend Shit Harper's Done, perhaps, but looking at other places that people can do serious thinking and reading about the campaign and the issues might be a good idea.
Scott Reid, Jamie Watt, Robin Sears, thank you very much on behalf of the entire audience. Taylor's going to